Montana Territory, 1878. The wind howled like a wounded animal across the snow-covered plains, carrying whispers of those who'd perished trying to tame this unforgiving land. Preston Baird pulled his sheepskin coat tighter around his lean frame as he surveyed the endless white landscape. At 26, he'd already learned the most important lesson the frontier could teach. A man alone survived. A man attached died with a broken heart. Preston adjusted his Stetson, the leather worn from years of shielding him from sun and snow alike. The cold had long since numbed his clean-shaven face, leaving only his eyes alert beneath the shadow of his hat brim. No reason to hurry back to an empty cabin, he muttered to his paint horse, Renegade. The gelding snorted in response, vapor clouds billowing from his nostrils. Standing 6 feet tall with shoulders broadened by years of breaking horses and driving cattle, Preston had the look of a man who belonged to this wild country. His green eyes held the distant look of someone who'd seen too much too young. Most women in Timber Creek found him handsome enough to pursue, but Preston had perfected the art of polite disinterest. Romance was a luxury he couldn't afford, not since he'd watched his father waste away after his mother's death from fever 5 years ago. That day, Preston had sworn never to let himself become so dependent on another soul. A man tied down was a man vulnerable, and vulnerability was fatal on the frontier. He'd built his small ranch alone, worked the cattle alone, and if loneliness sometimes gnawed at him during the long winter nights, he pushed it aside with whiskey and memories of his father's haunted eyes. "Better get moving before this storm gets worse," he told Renegade, swinging into the saddle. He'd come too far from home tracking a stray heifer to wait out the weather. The snow was falling heavier now, obscuring the distant tree line that marked the boundary of his property. Preston estimated he was still 5 miles from his cabin, a dangerous distance in a brewing blizzard. Halfway home, the wind shifted, bringing with it a sound that made Preston pull Renegade to a halt. He tilted his head, listening. There it was again, faint but unmistakable, a human cry carried on the wind. "Someone's out there, boy," he said, scanning the white emptiness. Common sense told him to keep riding toward shelter. Whoever was foolish enough to be caught in this weather had made their own choice. It wasn't his responsibility, yet the cry came again, this time sounding more desperate. Preston cursed under his breath. Damn it all, he turned Renegade toward the sound, knowing he might be riding to his death. But even a man determined to need no one couldn't ignore another soul fighting for survival. The snow was falling so thickly now that Preston could barely see 10 feet ahead. He followed the cries, which grew more sporadic as he pushed forward. When they stopped altogether, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through him. "Hello," he called out, his voice swallowed by the storm. "Where are you?" The silence stretched, and Preston was about to give up when Renegade suddenly shied, nearly unseating him. Through the curtain of white, he made out a dark shape half buried in snow. Dismounting quickly, he trudged forward, the snow already knee-deep. It was a wagon, listing badly to one side with a broken wheel. Beside it, huddled against the wood, was a woman. Her eyes were closed, her face nearly as white as the snow gathering on her midnight black hair. For a terrible moment, Preston thought he was too late. Then her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of summer violets. "Help," she whispered, the word barely audible. Without hesitation, Preston scooped her into his arms. She was slight, dressed in a woolen dress of deep blue beneath a heavy coat that wasn't nearly warm enough for a Montana blizzard. He estimated her to be no more than 22 or 23. What in God's name was she doing out here alone? "I've got you," he said gruffly, carrying her to Renegade. "We need to get you warm." "My things," she murmured, her voice weak. "They'll have to wait," Preston replied, settling her in the saddle before mounting behind her. He could feel her shivering violently against him. "My place isn't far." That was a lie. In this storm, the remaining miles would feel like 20. But Preston knew if he didn't get her to shelter soon, she wouldn't survive the night. He urged Renegade forward, one arm holding the reins while the other wrapped around the woman's waist to keep her secure. Her head lolled back against his chest, consciousness clearly slipping away. "Stay with me," he commanded, giving her a gentle shake. "What's your name?" "Hannah," she replied after a long moment. "Hannah Nilsen." "I'm Preston Baird. Where were you headed, Miss Nilsen?" "Timber Creek." Teaching position. Her words were becoming slurred with cold and exhaustion. Preston frowned. The school had been expecting a new teacher, but not until spring. "You're early." Wanted to settle in, Hannah managed before her head drooped again. No sleeping, Preston said sharply. Talk to me, tell me about where you're from. For the next hour, he kept her talking as best he could, extracting fragments about her life in Minnesota, her training as a teacher, the journey west. Each word seemed to cost her more effort, but Preston wouldn't let her slip into the deadly sleep that claimed so many in the cold. By the time his cabin came into view, a solid, one-room structure with smoke still rising from the chimney, Hannah had fallen silent despite his urging. Preston felt for her pulse, finding it weak but present. He'd never been so relieved to see his humble home. Inside, he worked quickly, stoking the fire to a roaring blaze before laying Hannah on his bed. Her clothes were soaked through from melted snow. Preston hesitated only briefly before doing what necessity demanded. With clinical efficiency, he removed her wet garments, averting his eyes as much as possible while wrapping her in warm blankets. He brewed strong coffee and heated soup he'd made the previous day. When Hannah's eyes finally opened again, Preston was sitting beside her, ready with a steaming cup. "Drink," he instructed, helping her sit up enough to sip the hot liquid. "Slow now." Hannah's violet eyes were clearer now, taking in her surroundings with growing awareness. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "My cabin, about 3 miles outside of Timber Creek." Preston handed her the cup, noticing the graceful shape of her hands as she took it. "The storm's too bad to go anywhere tonight. You'll stay here until it passes." A flush crept into Hannah's pale cheeks as she became aware of her state of undress beneath the blankets. "My clothes. Drying by the fire," Preston said matter-of-factly, standing to put distance between them. "Had to get you out of them before you froze to death. I didn't look any more than necessary, Miss Nilsen." Her blush deepened, but she nodded. "Thank you for saving my life, Mr. Baird." Preston busied himself with preparing a simple meal, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Hannah said softly, "not anyone. Not in this weather." She sipped her coffee, studying him over the rim. "I heard talk on the stage to Helena. They say Montana winters claim at least a dozen lives each year." "More," Preston replied grimly. "Which is why you shouldn't have been traveling alone so close to dark. What happened to your escort?" Hannah's expression hardened slightly. "I didn't have one. The man hired to drive me from Helena decided the money wasn't worth the risk once the snow started. He took my payment and left me with the wagon about 10 miles back." Preston's jaw tightened. "Name?" "Why, so you can call him out?" Hannah asked with unexpected sharpness. "Violence solves nothing, Mr. Baird." The corner of Preston's mouth twitched. "Wasn't planning to shoot him, Miss Nilsen. Just thought he might owe you a refund." Oh, her cheeks colored again. "His name was Davis, Tom Davis." Preston nodded, filing the information away. Tom Davis was known to frequent the saloons in Timber Creek. He'd have a word with the man one way or another. They ate in relative silence beans, bacon, and cornbread before Preston cleared the dishes. "You should rest," he said. "Take the bed." "I'll sleep by the fire." Hannah looked as though she might protest, but exhaustion was clearly overtaking her again. "My things," she began. "I'll retrieve what I can from your wagon tomorrow, weather permitting," Preston promised. "Now sleep." He settled into a chair near the hearth, listening as Hannah's breathing eventually deepened into the rhythm of sleep. Outside, the blizzard raged on, rattling the cabin's shutters and howling down the chimney. Preston stared into the flames, discomfited by the presence of another person in his carefully constructed solitude. It was just for a night or two, he reminded himself. Once the weather cleared, he'd take her to town and resume his life. This unexpected guest changed nothing about the truth Preston knew. Attachment was weakness, and weakness got you killed on the frontier. Yet as he drifted to sleep, Preston couldn't help glancing toward the woman in his bed, wondering what shade of violet her eyes might appear in daylight. Morning brought an eerie stillness. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white drifts that sparkled beneath a brilliant blue sky. Preston rose before dawn, as was his habit, and stepped outside to assess the damage. The snow was deep, nearly 3 feet in places, but the day promised to be clear. When he returned inside, stamping snow from his boots, Hannah was awake. She sat up in bed, the blankets pulled around her shoulders, her raven hair falling loose past her waist. "Good morning," she said, her voice stronger than it had been the previous night. Preston nodded, suddenly awkward in his own home. Morning storms past, your clothes should be dry enough to wear. Thank you, Hannah glanced toward where her dress and undergarments hung near the fire. Would you mind? Understanding immediately, Preston grabbed his coat. I'll check on the livestock, take your time. Outside in the barn, Preston busied himself with feeding his small herd of cattle and the 3 horses he kept, Renegade and 2 sturdy draft horses for working the land. The familiar routine calmed him, returning a sense of normalcy to a situation that felt anything but normal. By the time he returned to the cabin, Hannah was dressed in her now-dry blue wool dress, her hair neatly braided and pinned up. She stood by the stove, stirring something that smelled surprisingly good. I hope you don't mind, she said, gesturing to the pot. I found oats and some dried apples. Preston couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for him. No, that's fine, he said, hanging his coat by the door. They ate breakfast together, and Preston found himself studying Hannah when she wasn't looking. In daylight, he could see that her violet eyes were flecked with darker blue, like the night sky. Her features were delicate but strong, a straight nose, full lips, and a determined chin that hinted at stubbornness beneath her proper demeanor. How far is it to town? She asked, breaking the silence. On a normal day, about an hour's ride, Preston answered. But with snow this deep, it'll take longer, and that's assuming the path is passable. Hannah frowned. I need to report to the school board. They're expecting me by next week, but I'd hope to arrive early to prepare. They'll understand the delay, Preston said. No one expects travel in weather like this. Perhaps, but my belongings, Hannah bit her lip. Everything I own was in that wagon. Preston considered the situation. The smart thing would be to wait a few days for the snow to start melting, but the thought of sharing his small cabin with this woman for that long made him uneasy. It wasn't proper, for one thing. For another, her presence disrupted the solitude he'd cultivated so carefully. We'll try for your wagon today, he decided. It's not far. If we can salvage your things, we can store them here until the path to town clears. Relief flooded Hannah's face. Thank you, I couldn't bear to lose my books, and my mother's locket. Preston nodded, already planning the expedition. We'll take both draft horses. They handle deep snow better than Renegade. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the abandoned wagon. To Preston's surprise, it remained untouched. No predators or opportunistic travelers had discovered it. The broken wheel made recovery of the entire wagon impossible, but together they managed to salvage Hannah's trunks and bags, securing them to the horses. As Hannah tied down the last of her belongings, she let out a small cry of delight. My locket! She pulled a silver chain from a small pouch, holding up a heart-shaped pendant with obvious relief. I thought perhaps it had been lost in the snow. Preston watched as she fastened it around her neck, her fingers trembling slightly. Family heirloom? He asked. Hannah nodded, touching the locket gently. My mother gave it to me before she died. It's all I have left of her. The simple statement hit Preston harder than expected. He understood loss, understood the power of those last remaining connections. Without thinking, he said, I have my father's pocket watch. Only thing of his I kept. Hannah's eyes met his, and for a moment something passed between them, a recognition of shared experience. Then Preston turned away, uncomfortable with the moment of vulnerability. We should head back before the temperature drops, he said gruffly. The journey back to the cabin was slower with the laden horses, and darkness was falling by the time they arrived. Preston helped Hannah unload her belongings, storing most in the lean-to attached to the barn while bringing one trunk of necessities into the cabin. That night, after another simple meal, Hannah opened the trunk and pulled out a worn book. Do you like poetry, Mr. Baird? Preston, whittling by the fire, looked up with surprise. Never had much time for it. Hannah smiled, the firelight catching gold highlights in her dark hair. My father always said that's when you need it most, when you think you don't have time. She opened the book. May I read something? Too taken aback to refuse, Preston nodded. Hannah's voice filled the cabin, smooth and melodious, as she read Whitman's words about open roads and the journey of life. Preston found his whittling knife growing still in his hands as he listened. There was something almost hypnotic about her voice, about the way she brought the words to life. When she finished, the silence in the cabin seemed deeper somehow. Preston cleared his throat. That's nice, he said inadequately. Hannah closed the book gently. It reminds me why I came west, all that possibility. She looked around the cabin. Have you lived here long? 5 years, Preston replied. Built it myself after my father died. All alone? Hannah asked, her voice soft. Preston nodded, resuming his whittling. Better that way. Is it? The question hung in the air between them. Neither accusation nor challenge, but simple curiosity. Preston didn't answer. Instead, he stood and placed another log on the fire. We should turn in. I'll try to clear a path toward town tomorrow if the weather holds. But the weather didn't hold. Morning brought another storm, not as severe as the blizzard, but enough to make travel impossible. For 3 days, Preston and Hannah remained confined to the cabin, developing an uneasy routine. Preston handled the outdoor chores while Hannah cooked and tidied the cabin's interior, somehow making the sparse space seem more like a home than it had in years. In the evenings, she read aloud, poetry at first, then chapters from a novel she'd brought. Preston pretended disinterest but found himself listening intently, drawn into the stories despite himself. Hannah, for her part, seemed to respect his reticence, never pushing for conversation but responding warmly when he offered it. On the 4th morning, Preston woke to clear skies and the distant sound of bells. He stepped outside to find a figure approaching on horseback, following the rough path Preston had begun clearing the previous day. As the rider drew closer, Preston recognized Jacob Miller, the blacksmith from Timber Creek. Preston, Jacob called, waving as he approached. Thought I'd check if you survived that monster storm. Half the town's still digging out. We managed, Preston replied, then realized his mistake as Jacob's eyebrows rose. We? The blacksmith asked, dismounting with a curious expression. Before Preston could explain, Hannah appeared in the doorway of the cabin, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Good morning, she called pleasantly. Jacob's eyes widened, darting between Preston and Hannah with obvious speculation. Well now, he said with a growing smile, I see you've had company. It's not what you're thinking, Preston said quickly. Miss Nilsen is the new schoolteacher. I found her stranded during the blizzard. Hannah stepped forward, extending her hand to Jacob. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Miller. Jacob Miller, ma'am, blacksmith in Timber Creek. Jacob tipped his hat, still grinning. Everyone's been wondering what happened to you. Stage company said you left Helena more than a week ago. I hired a private driver who abandoned me when the weather turned, Hannah explained. Mr. Baird saved my life. Jacob nodded, but the knowing look didn't leave his face. Well, ain't that fortunate. Preston here doesn't usually involve himself much in town affairs. The path to town passable yet? Preston asked, eager to change the subject. Getting there, Jacob replied. Could probably make it by wagon tomorrow if the weather holds. He glanced at Hannah. School board's been fretting about you, Miss Nilsen. Mrs. Whittaker's particularly anxious to get you settled in the boarding house. I'm eager to begin my duties, Hannah said. Mr. Baird has been a perfect gentleman, but I'm sure we're both ready to resume normal life. Something in her tone caught Preston's attention. Was there a hint of regret there? He dismissed the thought immediately. Jacob stayed for coffee, filling them in on how the town had weathered the storm. When he finally departed, he left with a promise to send a wagon the following day if conditions allowed. After he'd gone, Preston turned to Hannah. Town will be talking. Hannah sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Yes, I expect so. Nothing ruins a schoolteacher's reputation faster than impropriety. I'll make sure everyone knows the truth, Preston said firmly. That it was a matter of survival, nothing more. Hannah studied him for a moment. Is that all it was, Mr. Baird, just survival? The question caught Preston off guard. What else would it be? Hannah shook her head slightly. Nothing, I suppose. Thank you for your concern for my reputation. That evening, their last together according to Jacob's prediction, felt different. A certain tension hung in the air as Hannah prepared a meal from the last of Preston's stores. They ate mostly in silence, both aware that their unusual arrangement was coming to an end. After dinner, Hannah didn't reach for her book as had become their custom. Instead, she said, Tell me about your ranch, Mr. Baird. You've built all this alone. Preston nodded, surprised by her interest. Started with just 10 acres and a few head of cattle. Up to 50 acres now, though only about 20 are cleared. Running 35 head of cattle. Not much compared to some spreads, but it's mine. It's impressive, Hannah said sincerely. Most men would have partners or hired hands. Preston shrugged, don't need the complications. Is that how you see other people, as complications? There was no judgment in her tone, only curiosity. Preston considered the question, finding himself answering more honestly than he intended. People leave, Miss Nilsen, or they die. Either way, you're left picking up the pieces. So you choose to be alone rather than risk loss, Hannah said softly. I choose to be self-sufficient, Preston corrected. There's a difference. Hannah was quiet for a moment. My father used to say that the greatest strength lies not in standing alone, but in knowing when to reach for another's hand. She smiled slightly. He was a preacher before he took up farming, always had a saying for everything. And where is he now? Preston asked, immediately regretting the harshness of the question. He died 3 years ago, Hannah answered without resentment. Along with my younger sister, influenza. I'm sorry, Preston said, meaning it. Hannah nodded in acknowledgement. Loss is part of life, Mr. Baird, but I don't believe it should define how we live. Preston had no answer for that. Instead, he stood and added wood to the fire, watching the flames leap higher. We should rest. Tomorrow will be a long day. Later, lying on his pallet near the hearth, Preston listened to Hannah's even breathing from his bed. The thought of returning to complete solitude after she left should have brought relief. Instead, he felt an unexpected hollowness. Just habit, he told himself. A few days was enough to grow accustomed to another presence. It would pass. But as sleep claimed him, Preston wondered if it was something more, if in following a stranger's cry through a blizzard, he'd unwittingly allowed a crack to form in the walls he'd built around himself. True to Jacob's prediction, a wagon arrived the next morning, driven by Samuel Powell, the owner of Timber Creek's general store. Miss Nilsen, glad to see you safe and sound, Powell called as he pulled up to the cabin. Mrs. Whittaker's got your room all ready at the boarding house. Hannah, standing beside Preston with her trunk at her feet, smiled. Thank you for coming all this way, Mr. Powell. Least we could do after you braved that storm to reach us, Powell replied, jumping down to help with her luggage. He nodded to Preston. Baird, town's mighty grateful to you for taking in our new schoolmarm. Preston merely nodded, helping load Hannah's trunk and the few bags he'd retrieved from her abandoned wagon. When everything was secured, an awkward moment followed as Hannah turned to him. Mr. Baird, she said, extending her hand, I can never thank you enough. Preston took her hand briefly. No need for thanks, Miss Nilsen. Just did what anyone would do. Nevertheless, she said, her violet eyes searching his face as if memorizing it, I'm grateful. Powell helped her into the wagon, and Preston watched as they pulled away, Hannah turning once to wave. Something twisted unexpectedly in his chest as the wagon disappeared around the bend. Turning back to his empty cabin, Preston tried to embrace the returning silence. This was what he wanted, his life back, his routine undisturbed. Yet as he moved through his chores that day, the cabin seemed emptier than before, the silence more profound. A week passed, then 2. The snow began to melt, creating muddy conditions that kept Preston busy with repairs and preparations for spring planting. He made no trips to town, telling himself there was too much work to be done. If thoughts of Hannah Nilsen sometimes intruded, memories of her reading by firelight or the scent of her hair as he'd carried her through the storm, he pushed them aside. Nearly a month after Hannah had left, Preston finally rode into Timber Creek for supplies. The town was buzzing with activity as winter's grip loosened. He tied Renegade outside Powell's store and stepped inside, nodding to the proprietor. Baird, about time you showed your face, Powell greeted him. Beginning to think you'd become a complete hermit. Preston ignored the comment, focusing on his supply list. As Powell gathered his items, the storekeeper kept up a steady stream of town gossip. Miss Nilsen's been a real blessing for the school, he mentioned casually. Children actually want to attend now. She started a lending library too, convinced folks to donate books so everyone can read, not just those who can afford to buy them. Preston grunted non-committally, though he found himself listening closely. Course, she's had no shortage of suitors, Powell continued. Marshall Peterson's been particularly attentive. Rumor is he might propose come summer. Something cold settled in Preston's stomach. He handed over payment for his supplies with more force than necessary. Appreciate the gossip, Powell, but I've got work waiting. Powell grinned knowingly. School gets out at 3 if you're interested. Preston shot him a dark look and left without reply, loading his supplies onto Renegade with quick, angry movements. What did he care if Hannah had suitors? It was expected. A beautiful, educated woman like her wouldn't remain unattached long in a town with so few eligible women. He was about to mount up when a familiar voice stopped him. Mr. Baird. Preston turned to find Hannah approaching, a stack of books in her arms and a smile lighting her face. She wore a forest green dress that complemented her pale skin, her hair arranged more elaborately than he remembered from their days in the cabin. Miss Nilsen, he acknowledged, hat in hand. You're looking well. As are you, she replied. I hoped I might see you in town eventually. An awkward silence fell between them until Preston gestured to her books. Powell mentioned you started a lending library. Hannah nodded, her expression brightening. Yes, the response has been wonderful. Are you interested in borrowing something? I have several books on agriculture that might be useful. Don't have much time for reading, Preston said, then regretted his brusqueness when disappointment flickered across her face. Of course, you must be very busy with spring coming. Hannah shifted the books in her arms. I wanted to thank you again for your help, and to let you know that I was able to retrieve the rest of my belongings from the wagon site once the snow melted. Preston nodded. Glad to hear it. Another silence stretched between them. Finally, Hannah said, Well, I should get back to the school. It was good to see you, Mr. Baird. She turned to leave, and Preston found himself speaking without planning to. How are you finding Timber Creek? Hannah paused, looking back with surprise. It's lovely. The people have been very welcoming. Powell says you have admirers, Preston said, immediately cursing himself for the comment. A faint blush colored Hannah's cheeks. Mr. Powell enjoys his gossip. She hesitated, then added, I've had some gentlemen callers. Yes, it's flattering. Marshall Peterson, Preston couldn't seem to stop himself. Hannah's blush deepened. He's been kind, as have others. Before Preston could respond, a man's voice called out, Miss Nilsen. They both turned to see Marshall Peterson approaching, tall, well-dressed, and confidently handsome in a way that made Preston instantly dislike him. I thought we were meeting at 4, Peterson said as he reached them, giving Preston a curious glance. We are, Hannah confirmed. I was just speaking with Mr. Baird. He's the one who rescued me during the blizzard. Peterson's expression cleared. Ah, yes, the whole town's in your debt, Baird. This lady has brought new life to our school. He placed a possessive hand at Hannah's elbow. I'm escorting Miss Nilsen to the church social planning committee this afternoon. Preston nodded stiffly. Don't let me keep you. Hannah seemed about to say something more, but Peterson was already steering her away. Good day, Mr. Baird, she called over her shoulder. Preston watched them go, noting how Peterson bent close to speak in Hannah's ear, making her laugh. Something uncomfortably like jealousy twisted in his gut. Forcing it aside, he mounted Renegade and headed home, determined to put Hannah Nilsen out of his mind once and for all. But fate had other plans. 2 days later, Preston was mending fence on the western edge of his property when he spotted a lone rider approaching. As the figure drew closer, he recognized the midnight black hair and green riding habit of Hannah Nilsen. She rode well, he noted with surprise, sitting the borrowed horse with natural grace. When she reached him, she reined in, her cheeks flushed from the ride. Miss Nilsen, Preston said, setting down his tools. This is unexpected. I hope I'm not intruding, she said, sounding suddenly uncertain. Mr. Powell said this was the quickest way to reach your property. You're not intruding, Preston assured her, curious despite himself. Is something wrong in town? Hannah shook her head. No, nothing like that. She dismounted, handling the reins with practiced ease. I actually came to bring you something. From her saddlebag, she produced a book bound in worn leather. It's a journal on cattle breeding and land management written by a successful rancher in Wyoming. I thought it might be useful to you. Preston took the book, genuinely surprised by the thoughtful gesture. Thank you, that's kind of you. Hannah smiled, clearly pleased by his reaction. I remembered you mentioned wanting to expand your herd. The author discusses methods for improving stock quality without significant expense. Preston leafed through the pages, noting the detailed illustrations and practical advice. This does look useful, he admitted. You can keep it, Hannah said. It was donated to the lending library, but honestly, I think you'll make better use of it than anyone else in Timber Creek. Preston looked up from the book, studying her face. You rode all this way to bring me a book. A faint blush colored Hannah's cheeks. I also wanted to see how you were faring. After our encounter in town, I realized we hardly had a chance to speak properly. Would you like some coffee? Preston asked impulsively. Least I can do for the delivery. Hannah's smile widened. I'd like that very much. They walked together to the cabin, leading her horse alongside Renegade, who was ground-tied nearby. Preston found himself pointing out improvements he'd made to the property: the new corral, the expanded chicken coop, the ground he'd cleared for additional planting. Hannah listened attentively, asking intelligent questions that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. At the cabin, Preston busied himself with making coffee while Hannah looked around the familiar space. It feels different in daylight, she observed. Smaller somehow. It's not much, Preston acknowledged, feeling self-conscious about the humble surroundings. No, I didn't mean, Hannah shook her head. It's a fine home, Mr. Baird. You should be proud of what you've built here. Preston handed her a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. It's enough for one person. Hannah took a sip, then asked the question Preston somehow knew was coming. Do you never get lonely out here? Preston hesitated, finding himself unwilling to offer his usual dismissive response. Sometimes, he admitted, but it's safer this way. Safer than what? Hannah asked softly. Preston moved to the window, looking out at the land he'd worked so hard to tame. My father was the strongest man I knew, he said finally. When my mother died, something in him just broke. He stopped caring about the ranch, about himself, about me. The admission cost him something to voice aloud. I watched him die by inches over months, not from illness but from grief. Hannah was silent for a moment. And you decided never to risk that kind of pain. Wouldn't you? Preston turned to face her. You've lost family too, you know what it does. I do, Hannah agreed, but I also know that my memories of them, the love we shared, are worth the pain of losing them. She set her cup down and moved closer to him. If I had chosen never to love my father or sister for fear of eventually losing them, I would have lost so much more. Her words struck something deep in Preston, a truth he'd been avoiding for years. Before he could respond, Hannah glanced toward the window, noticing the lengthening shadows. I should start back, she said reluctantly. I promised Mrs. Whittaker I'd return before dark. Preston nodded, both relieved and disappointed by the interruption. I'll ride with you to the main road. As they prepared to leave, Hannah paused at the door. There's a Founders' Day celebration in town next Saturday. The whole community attends. She hesitated, then added, I would be pleased if you would come, Mr. Baird. Preston had avoided town gatherings for years, finding them tedious and uncomfortable. His instinct was to refuse immediately. Instead, he found himself saying, I'll consider it. The smile that lit Hannah's face was worth the discomfort of the commitment. I hope you do. Preston escorted her to the road that led to town, watching until she was safely on her way before turning back to his property. As he resumed his fence mending, his thoughts remained on violet eyes and challenging words about the value of connection. For the next few days, Preston found himself thinking of the Founders' Day celebration with increasing frequency. He told himself he wouldn't go, that he had too much work, that town gatherings were a waste of time. Yet on Saturday morning, he found himself shaving carefully, putting on his best shirt, and saddling Renegade for the ride to town. Timber Creek was transformed for the celebration. Bunting and flags decorated the main street, tables laden with food lined the area near the church, and a makeshift dance floor had been constructed in the center of town. Nearly everyone from miles around had gathered, dressed in their finest clothes and ready to celebrate the town's founding 20 years earlier. Preston felt immediately out of place despite his efforts to look presentable. He tied Renegade at the hitching post and stood awkwardly at the edge of the gathering, already regretting his decision to come. He was about to leave when a familiar voice called his name. Mr. Baird. You came, Hannah approached, radiant in a dress of pale lavender that matched her eyes. Her hair was arranged in an intricate style with a few curls framing her face. Miss Nilsen, Preston acknowledged, suddenly glad he'd made the effort. You look, he searched for an appropriate word. Nice. Hannah's smile suggested she understood the inadequacy of his compliment was due to discomfort rather than lack of appreciation. Thank you. Come, let me introduce you to some people. Many have asked about the man who rescued their new teacher. Before Preston could object, Hannah had taken his arm and was guiding him through the crowd. To his surprise, people seemed genuinely pleased to see him. Parents of schoolchildren thanked him earnestly for saving Miss Nilsen. Even Marshal Peterson, clearly disappointed to see Preston with Hannah, was cordial enough. As the afternoon progressed, Preston found himself relaxing marginally. The food was good, the company not as intrusive as he'd feared, and Hannah stayed near him, easing his interactions with her natural charm and ready conversation. When the music started and couples began to gather for dancing, Hannah looked at him expectantly. Preston shook his head slightly. I don't dance, Miss Nilsen. Everyone dances at Founder's Day, she insisted. Even those who claim they don't. Before Preston could refuse again, Marshal Peterson appeared at Hannah's side. May I have this dance, Miss Nilsen? He asked, offering his hand with confident charm. Hannah hesitated, glancing at Preston, who nodded stiffly. Go ahead, I'll get some punch. As Hannah was led away, Preston watched Peterson place his hand on her waist, drawing her closer than seemed necessary for a public dance. The possessive way the man looked at Hannah made Preston's jaw clench. He turned away, heading for the punch bowl to cool his inexplicable anger. She's quite something, isn't she? A voice said beside him. Mrs. Whittaker, the widow who ran the boarding house where Hannah lived, was watching the dancers with a knowing expression. Who? Preston asked, feigning ignorance. Mrs. Whittaker chuckled. Don't play coy with me, young man. I've seen how you look at our schoolteacher. Preston frowned. I don't look at her any particular way. If you say so, the older woman replied, clearly unconvinced. I just thought you should know that Peterson plans to propose to her after the celebration. Has a ring and everything. The punch suddenly tasted bitter in Preston's mouth. That's fast. They've only known each other a short time. That's how it often works out here, Mrs. Whittaker said with a shrug. Good women are scarce. When a man finds one, he doesn't waste time. She gave Preston a pointed look. Especially when there might be competition. Before Preston could respond, the music ended. He watched as Peterson kept hold of Hannah's hand, leading her toward the edge of the gathering. Preston's stomach clenched. Was the man proposing already? Without conscious decision, Preston set down his cup and strode toward them, reaching the pair just as Peterson was speaking in low, earnest tones. Miss Nilsen, Preston interrupted. I believe you promised to show me that book display you mentioned. Hannah looked up, surprise evident on her face. I did. For the lending library, Preston added pointedly. Understanding dawned in her eyes. Oh. Yes, of course. She turned apologetically to Peterson. Would you excuse us? It won't take long. Peterson's expression darkened, but he nodded stiffly. Of course, we'll continue our conversation later. As Preston led Hannah away, she whispered, There is no book display, Mr. Baird. I know, he replied. You looked like you needed rescuing. Hannah's lips curved in amusement. Twice now you've come to my aid. I'm beginning to feel quite the damsel in distress. Was I wrong? Preston asked as they reached the relative quiet behind the schoolhouse. Hannah sighed. No, Mr. Peterson was becoming rather insistent about his intentions. Mrs. Whittaker says he plans to propose today. Hannah's eyes widened. Already, we've barely become acquainted. That's what I said, Preston agreed, feeling unreasonably pleased by her reaction. Hannah studied his face in the fading afternoon light. Why did you really come to the celebration today, Mr. Baird? The direct question caught Preston off guard. He could have offered any number of plausible excuses: curiosity, community obligation, boredom. Instead, he found himself answering truthfully, I came to see you. The simple admission hung between them. Hannah's expression softened. Preston, she said, using his given name for the first time. There you are, Peterson's voice cut through the moment as he rounded the corner of the schoolhouse. His expression hardened when he saw them standing close together. Am I interrupting something? Not at all, Hannah said smoothly. Mr. Baird was just telling me about a book he's been reading, the one I lent him on cattle breeding. Peterson looked skeptical but nodded. The fireworks will be starting soon. I thought we might watch them together. He extended his hand to Hannah expectantly. Preston stepped back, the moment broken. I should be heading home. Cattle need tending, even on celebration days. You're not staying for the fireworks? Hannah asked, disappointment evident in her voice. Preston shook his head. Not much for loud noises and crowds. Thank you for the invitation, Miss Nilsen. It was pleasant, he nodded to Peterson. Marshall. As he walked away, Preston heard Peterson say, I don't understand what you see in that unsociable rancher. Hannah's reply was too soft to hear, but Preston didn't wait to try to catch it. He untied Renegade and mounted, casting one last glance toward the gathering. In the distance, he could see Hannah still standing with Peterson, her lavender dress distinct among the crowd. Something in his chest ached at the sight, a feeling he didn't want to examine too closely. The ride home was long and silent, broken only by the distant pop of the first fireworks as Preston approached his cabin. Alone again in his empty home, he tried to convince himself that this was what he preferred: solitude, independence, safety from attachment. Yet for the first time, the silence felt less like freedom and more like emptiness. Spring progressed into early summer, bringing with it the intense work of calving season. Preston threw himself into the labor, rising before dawn and working until he was too exhausted to think, especially about a certain schoolteacher with violet eyes and challenging words. He avoided town entirely, sending lists with neighboring ranchers when supplies were needed. If those neighbors sometimes mentioned that Miss Nilsen had asked after him, Preston pretended not to care. And if they mentioned that Marshall Peterson was still calling regularly at the boarding house, Preston made a point of changing the subject immediately. 6 weeks after the Founders' Day celebration, Preston was repairing his barn roof when he spotted a rider approaching. His heart jumped traitorously before he recognized Jacob Miller's stocky form rather than Hannah's slender silhouette. Baird, Jacob called as he drew near, got a message for you from town. Preston climbed down from the roof, wiping sweat from his brow. What kind of message? Jacob dismounted, looking uncharacteristically serious. It's about Miss Nilsen. Preston's stomach clenched. What about her? She's leaving Timber Creek, Jacob said. School terms ended and she's accepted a position in Helena. Bigger school, better pay. The news hit Preston with unexpected force. When? He managed to ask. Tomorrow morning, Jacob replied. Stage leaves at 9. He studied Preston's face. Thought you might want to know. Preston nodded stiffly. Appreciate the information. Jacob hesitated, then added, she turned down Peterson's proposal, you know. Twice, from what I hear. Preston's head snapped up. She did. Yep, man's been drowning his sorrows at the saloon for days. Jacob mounted his horse again. Anyway, thought you should know about her leaving. Do with the information what you will. After Jacob departed, Preston stood motionless in his yard, mind racing. Hannah was leaving, tomorrow, without a word to him, though why should she tell him? They weren't anything to each other, just two people thrown together by circumstance, who'd shared a few conversations and one interrupted moment behind a schoolhouse. Yet the thought of never seeing her again left a hollow feeling in his chest that no amount of reasoning could dispel. Preston spent a restless night, alternating between convincing himself Hannah's departure was for the best and imagining riding to town too. To what? Ask her to stay? Declare feelings he barely understood himself. The very idea was terrifying. By morning he'd decided to do nothing. Hannah deserved the opportunity in Helena. She was educated, refined, meant for more than a small frontier town, let alone the isolated existence of a ranch wife. The thought brought a pang he refused to acknowledge. Preston was mucking out the barn, determinedly focused on his work, when the distant sound of bells made him freeze. Stepping outside, he spotted a wagon coming up the path to his property, a hired rig from town, not unlike the one that had taken Hannah away months earlier. As it drew closer, Preston's breath caught. Hannah sat beside the driver, her face turned toward the approaching ranch. When the wagon stopped in the yard, she descended without assistance, thanking the driver and asking him to wait. She wore a traveling outfit of deep blue, her hair pinned beneath a matching hat. She looked poised, beautiful, and utterly out of place in his dusty yard. Miss Nilsen, Preston said, setting down his pitchfork. This is unexpected. Mr. Baird, Hannah replied, a slight tremor in her voice betraying her composure. I hope I'm not intruding. Never, he answered honestly. Jacob told me you're leaving for Helena. Hannah nodded. Yes, the stage departs in an hour. She glanced around the ranch, taking in the improvements Preston had made since winter, the extended corral, the new chicken coop, the vegetable garden now flourishing beside the cabin. Your place looks wonderful. You've worked hard. Thank you, Preston said, unsure why she had come. To say goodbye, the thought brought that hollow feeling back to his chest. Hannah took a deep breath. I came because I couldn't leave without asking you a question. She met his eyes directly, her own filled with a mixture of determination and vulnerability. Why didn't you come back to town after Founder's Day? The question caught Preston off guard. I had work here calving season. For 6 weeks, Hannah challenged softly. Preston looked away. What does it matter now? You're leaving. It matters to me, Hannah insisted. She stepped closer. I turned down Marshall Peterson's proposal twice. So Jacob mentioned, Preston said, heart beating faster. Do you know why? When Preston didn't answer, Hannah continued. Because I realized I was comparing every man in Timber Creek to someone else. Someone who rescued me in a blizzard and pretends not to enjoy poetry and looks at me when he thinks I won't notice. Preston's throat went dry. Hannah, I have built a good life, she interrupted. I'm respected as a teacher. I have opportunities in Helena that would advance my career. I should be content with that. Her voice softened. But I find myself wondering about a different life. One that might include a small cabin and a man who values his independence above all else. Hope flared in Preston's chest, so intense it was almost painful. I'm not good at this, he managed, at letting people in. I know, Hannah said with a gentle smile. You've made that abundantly clear, but I also know that you followed my cry through a blizzard when most men would have kept writing. That suggests a heart capable of more than you give it credit for. Preston took a step toward her, then another, until they were standing close enough that he could see the flecks of darker blue in her violet eyes. If I asked you to stay, he said carefully, it wouldn't be fair. Helena offers you more than Timber Creek ever could, more than I could. Hannah reached up, placing her palm against his cheek. Perhaps you should let me decide what I value most. And if what I'm offering isn't enough, Preston asked, voicing his deepest fear. What are you offering, Preston Baird? Hannah asked softly. Preston took a deep breath. Myself, this ranch, a life that won't be easy but that I'll work every day to make worth your choice. He covered her hand with his own, turning to press a kiss to her palm. I'm offering a future we would build together, if you want it. Hannah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. That's all I've been waiting to hear. Preston leaned down, closing the distance between them as his lips found hers in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers. Stay, he whispered, not for Timber Creek, for me. Hannah smiled, her joy radiating between them. Yes. 1 year later, Preston stood on the porch of his expanded cabin, now a proper small house with 2 bedrooms, a larger kitchen and bookshelves lining one wall of the main room. Behind him, the sound of happy conversation drifted through the open door as friends from town celebrated the official opening of the Timber Creek Lending Library's rural branch, operated by Mrs. Hannah Baird 2 days a week from their home. The ranch had prospered over the past year, partly due to the advice in the book Hannah had given him, but more significantly because of the partnership they'd forged together. Hannah had continued teaching in Timber Creek while helping with the ranch in her spare time. Her organizational skills and education had proven invaluable for record-keeping and correspondence with cattle buyers. But it was her presence that had transformed the ranch from merely a property into a home. Books filled the shelves, music sometimes filled the air, and laughter always filled the rooms that had once known only silence. Admiring your handiwork, Hannah asked, slipping her arm through his as she joined him on the porch. Her free hand rested on the slight swell of her belly, their first child due in the winter. Admiring everything, Preston replied, covering her hand with his own. I never thought I'd have all this. Hannah leaned her head against his shoulder. Nor I, though I had hoped, from the moment a stubborn cowboy followed my cry through a blizzard. Preston smiled, remembering the journey that had brought them here, from a desperate rescue in a snowstorm to a life built on mutual respect and deepening love. That blizzard was the best thing that ever happened to me, he said, turning to face his wife. It led me straight to my future. Hannah rose on tiptoes to kiss him, her violet eyes shining with the same love that had melted the ice around his heart. And what a beautiful future it is. Together they turned back toward their home and the life they were building. A life richer and fuller than Preston had ever dared to imagine when he'd first heard a stranger's cry carried on the winter wind.